Good morning. It's Monday morning. So yesterday was a lazy Sunday, so I didn't get a lot done, but I didn't really expect to get a lot done. I did manage to ink in these two pages. Um, but first, let me mention that I finished reading the next chapter in this book on the history of the newspaper comic strip. So we are finishing the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties really being 1918 to about 1928. But anyway, at this time period, we have a proliferation of sort of the domestic comic strip, often starring a flapper or a young woman who has become a secretary and moved to the big city. And as I've mentioned before, in some ways, this reminds me of, at least in spirit, some of the modern shoujo manga in the sense of being, kind of having the conflict being the domestic world and relationships with each other and things like that. These are not as flowery as shoujo, and I'm not saying they're the same thing, but I mean there are certain similarities, and it's uh, comforting to see that certain ideas come and go regularly. In this time period, we actually have a lot of strips of which I'm not terribly familiar, although I do like the cross-hatching here. But one that did catch my interest is Skippy by Percy Crosby. Now, they only give a single example of Skippy here, but from the description given of it, this cartoonist experimented a lot with the format of his strip in the sense that he could have three panels, or he would divide this into four, or maybe have one. This is a very modern form of cartooning, and by modern I mean in the last 30 or 40 years. But this was less usually done for dailies. Back then, dailies were still a new concept at this time. So it's nice to see some of the early innovation. I would like to do more research on Skippy. Maybe I could find some online references. There are also some animal comics, and apparently the Cats and Jammer Kids were still going on strong. I believe I have a few examples of the Cats and Jammer Kids in a oversized coffee table book that I have. We can learn more about them later. I'm not an expert in the Cats and Jammer Kids, but they're mentioned so often in this history that they are probably worth studying. George Harriman of Crazy Cat, of course, is mentioned quite a lot. It seems like he went through lots of different dailies that daily concepts that would last a few months or a couple of years. Nowadays, he's just known for Crazy Cat. I did find it interesting here that there was a Canadian cartoonist, Arch Dale, who essentially did a kind of a knockoff of Crazy Cat, which I find amusing because even though Crazy Cat was renowned among artists, it was never particularly uh, terribly popular among the public, as far as I can tell, except for Hearst himself. But in some ways, Hearst created the whole idea of the comic strip, and this was his money to throw around. I think that's about it for the 1920s. Uh, Occasionally, we'll find out. This is kind of a fun little thing that this comic strip or that comic strip added words to the English language. So apparently, our boarding house from 1921 added the words "egad" to English, which I'm fairly certain "egad" existed. It seems like sort of uh, sort of how to say this. It's profanity that's been ameliorated. I'm sure there's a term for that, but perhaps perhaps it popularized that word. Anyway, the next chapter I think will be coming to props. Will be coming to the 1930s, and we're probably going to start coming to more adventure comic strips and more complex story themes. Anyway, that's it for the history of comics. And as for my art, I inked in this page. This was a pencil sketch that I drew during church. I only took a little bit of it then, and this is based on the local comic book store where I lived some time ago, and unfortunately that comic book store went out of business, but I have some nice memories of it. This is sort of a fantasy version of it, so everything's sort of crazy and tilted. I've done another drawing of that store. We can talk about that later. Actually, I could probably go online and find photographs of that store. And then I inked in the next page in this sketchbook. I'm going to try and the line art for the next 4 pages, and then that will conclude the story of the alien St. Patrick's Day parade. And then after that, I will work on the line art for the smaller sketchbook, and I hope by July I can just work on painting. I'll paint all 3 of the sketchbooks, and then one of them I can enter in the state fair, and the others were essentially practice. And anyway, that is my update, and I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.